continue to rise. Since April, more than 26,000 people fleeing hostilities have registered at transit centers. In response, our partners are working with authorities to open new sites in the Sumy and Dnipro regions to meet rising needs. Across Ukraine, 3.7 million people remain displaced, with nearly 6 million refugees abroad. Additionally, unverified reports in recent days and weeks indicate civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in the regions of Kursk, Bryansk, Belgorod, Voronezh, Kaluga, Lipetsk, and Tula regions in the Russian Federation. Under international humanitarian law, all parties must take all feasible precautions to avoid and minimize civilian harm. Mr. President, the continued use of anti-personnel mines puts civilian lives and livelihoods at risk every day. The Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention strictly prohibits their use. Under this convention, states have agreed that the harm caused by these weapons is unacceptable and that considerations of humanity must impose limits on their use. We cannot go back. This is why we note with alarm the recent decree by the Ukrainian president announcing Ukraine's withdrawal from the convention. This follows the regrettable decisions of neighboring countries to withdraw from this convention. Assertions of exceptional threats and military necessity cannot outweigh international humanitarian law, which seeks to limit human suffering precisely when a state is fighting against its enemy. The Secretary General has urged all states to adhere to humanitarian disarmament treaties and immediately halt any steps towards their withdrawal. Mr. President, despite relentless risks, our humanitarian partners in Ukraine continue their vital work, reaching more than 3.6 million people with emergency health care, shelter, clean water, and cash to families since January. But access remains precarious. In regions such as Kherson and Donetsk, intensified fighting has forced aid convoys to be delayed or suspended, putting humanitarian workers at risk and interrupting life-saving support. We remain committed to ensuring all necessary arrangements are in place to reach people in need safely and without obstruction. Our ability to reach an estimated 1.5 million civilians in areas under the control of the Russian Federation, including parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, remains extremely limited and increasingly difficult. It is not for lack of capacity or will, but rather persistent access impediments that prevent us from getting help to those who need it most. At the same time, we urgently need the resources to sustain and expand efforts where we have access. International humanitarian law could not be clearer. All parties must allow safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to civilians in need, no matter where they are or who controls the territory. Mr. President, despite the growing scale of needs, funding remains critically low. Just 34% of the $2.6 billion required for the 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan has been received, forcing cuts to vital programs just as needs are soaring. Cash assistance, mental health support, and services to respond to gender-based violence have been slashed due to funding shortfalls. Without an immediate influx of resources, even prioritized programs will be at risk, just as the people of Ukraine approach a fourth wartime winter. Last week, the United Nations and our humanitarian partners launched the 2025-2026 Winter Response Plan, which aims to reach 1.7 million people with heating support, winter clothing, shelter repairs, emergency energy solutions, and cash. The plan prioritizes households in frontline and collective sites where freezing temperatures could turn already dire conditions into deadly ones. We urge member states to act now so that emergency supplies are in place before winter hits and conditions make it far harder to reach those in need. Mr. President, allow me to close with 3 urgent messages to this Council. First, civilians and civilian objects must be protected. The scale of civilian death and injury and the destruction to homes, schools, hospitals, and displacement centers must stop. Disproportionate and other indiscriminate attacks are strictly prohibited. Second, ensure humanitarian access. All parties must facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to civilians in need wherever they are. The Council and all member states must exert their influence to ensure civilians are protected and humanitarians can reach those in need. Third, support the response. Ukrainians cannot afford delays or donor fatigue. Every contribution counts. Mr. President, this war continues to inflict suffering on a staggering scale. The trauma is daily, the destruction is widespread, and the resilience of civilians is being pushed to its limits. But our commitment to assist them must not waver. Thank you.
I thank AST Masuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And to begin with, I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Assistant Secretary General Jenča for their insight and contribution to today's discussion. And I welcome representative of Ukraine in the chamber. Mr. President, today's briefings painted a comprehensive picture of the latest developments on the ground, and the picture is grim. Civilian casualties are on the rise. Homes, schools, and hospitals continue to be destroyed. To top it all, there is no end in sight to all the death and suffering. Since the beginning of the year, Russia has been escalating its aggression. By March, Russia was launching more than 1,000 drones and missiles per week, terrorizing Ukrainians in their homes and shelters night after night. This month, the attacks have been particularly destructive. They culminated on the 9th of July, when Russia launched its largest ever aerial attack, using more than 700 drones and missiles. This vividly illustrates the accelerating pace of the escalation. This month alone, Russia has launched more than 5,000 drones and missiles. The ramped-up aerial attacks have a devastating impact on the civilian population, as we heard. As the briefers pointed out, the numbers of civilians killed or injured have been rising sharply in the first half of 2025. In fact, June was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians in 3 years. In addition to all this, civilians across Ukraine are each day exposed to arbitrary detentions, torture, executions, and sexual violence. These acts are an obvious violation of international humanitarian law. Slovenia condemns the aggression and the latest escalatory steps, Mr. President. Slovenia welcomes all diplomatic efforts toward a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, including the latest meeting between the two countries held last Wednesday. We welcome the agreement on the POW exchange in this regard. However, the outcomes of both previous and recent talks remain insufficient. Instead of genuine peace talks, we are witnessing a surge in drone production. Instead of respect for international law, more and more armaments are being procured, including from countries under UN sanctions. Instead of reuniting families, Ukrainian children remain displaced and deported. Instead of a ceasefire, Ukrainian cities continue to burn. Mr. President, we are in a desperate need of a change of pace. We need action to prevent further civilian deaths and finally make a decisive step on the path to peace, as implored by this Council last February. For months, we have listened to pleas of members of this Council for ceasefire. To little avail. Enough time has passed. This Council needs to act. We need a ceasefire resolution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary Jenča and Assistant Secretary General Masuya for their briefings. Colleagues, we are once again gathered in this chamber to address Russia's ongoing illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. A war that continues to escalate in intensity as the Russian Federation persists in its aggression against its sovereign neighbor with increased ferocity. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 key points. First, in recent weeks, we have witnessed the most severe attacks against civilians across Ukraine in over 3 years. A relentless and sustained Russian blitz of drones, missiles, and bombs has inflicted death, destruction, and despair. Kyiv has been subjected to intense overnight missile and drone attacks. Since then, several other regions, including Dnipro, Kharkiv, Kherson, Odessa, Sumy, and Vinnytsia, also came under heavy attack. Deliberate assaults continue to be launched against civilian targets, from residential blocks and hospitals to shopping centers and other critical infrastructure. Nowhere is safe for Ukraine's civilians. In the last week alone, at least 20 civilians have been killed and more than 100 injured, including several children. Russia's claim that its armed forces only attack military targets is nothing more than this distortion of the truth. The reality on the ground tells a different story, as we also just heard from Assistant Secretary General Masuya. This is in clear violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a callous disregard for civilians. Second, Mr. President, Russia's disregard for international law is having an outside impact on children who suffer some of the gravest consequences. For 3 consecutive years, the Russian armed forces have been listed in the annex of the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict for committing grave violations against Ukrainian children. From the latest report, we have learned that Russia's actions in the past year have reached new levels of brutality. In addition to the unlawful abduction of thousands of Ukrainian children, Russian forces killed and maimed 671 children, according to the report. They also attacked over 500 schools and more than 300 hospitals. This marks a 60% increase in child casualties and a staggering 150% increase in attacks on schools and hospitals compared to 2023. We recall that civilian objects are protected under international humanitarian law and must not be targeted. Denmark fully supports the Secretary General's call for Russia to immediately cease all violations against children. We urge Russia to take concrete steps to prevent further violations by developing and implementing a joint action plan with the United Nations. Third, Mr. President, Russia's senseless, full-scale aggression continues in its 4th year. It must come to an end. For months, Ukraine has been ready to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. We call on Russia to accept this offer without any delay. Such a response would reflect a genuine commitment to peace. While we welcome the agreement on new exchanges of prisoners of war reached in Istanbul this week, we cannot ignore that the Kremlin continues to pursue its illegal and brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This week, Russia has continued to destroy cities, killing civilians, and targeting civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. These actions undermine the foundations for peace. Mr. President, in conclusion, while Russia's attacks intensify, we increase our support for Ukraine. We reiterate our call for a just, sustainable, and lasting peace in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We have reaffirmed the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, until the Ukrainians can once again live in peace and freedom in their own country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I would like to thank ASG Miroslav Zhenka and ASG Joyce Msuya. Thank you for your briefings, which recalled the gravity of the situation. President, a week ago, President Zelensky said once again that he was prepared to partake in direct peace talks with the Russian president. What was Russia's response? Massive strikes on Ukrainian cities, very far from the front line, and this between the 20th and 21st of July. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot, arrived in Kiev just a few hours later to reiterate our determination to increase pressure on Russia and to give Ukraine the means to defend itself. This is what we're doing together with the European Union. By systematically attacking civilian targets and essential infrastructure, essential for daily life, Russia is trying to sow fear and discord in Ukraine. Unable to break through the front line for over 3 years now, Russia is trying to break the rearguard. Russia must understand that this strategy of massive and systematic violation of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions is not only illegal, what's more is it's useless. Russia will not manage to erode the morale of the Ukrainian people, and France would like to commend Ukraine's resilience and courage. France is also systematically targeting energy infrastructure. It is compromising without hesitation nuclear safety and security. In Chernobyl, our minister saw considerable damage that was done in February by a Russian Shahed drone, a drone which perforated the confinement sarcophagus, which prevents radioactive emissions. President, in Istanbul 2 days ago, Ukraine reiterated its readiness to implement an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, as Ukraine has been doing for 5 months now. Russia once again refused. Russia reiterated its maximalist demands set out in the memorandum it gave to Ukraine on the 2nd of June. Russia cannot demand Ukraine's capitulation as a precondition for stopping the hostilities. President, in order to live up to its responsibilities, this Council cannot simply deplore civilian suffering and call for peace talks. The Council must, first, call a spade and recall the fundamentals of the conflict. Faced with Ukrainians' aspirations to liberty and democracy, it is Russia which on 2 occasions invaded Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, and this in flagrant violation of the Charter. Second, the Council must condemn violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, violations committed by Russia. We must call on it to put an end to this. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians constitute war crimes. Third, the Council must address its appeals to Russia, its appeals for an end to the fighting. It is Russia which can immediately put an end to this war of aggression and accept a ceasefire. Fourth, we must tirelessly recall that peace, in order to be lasting, must respect international law. Negotiations will only be effective if Russia accepts these negotiations in good faith and if it agrees to respect the independence, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ukraine's future security must be upheld. In the immediate future, there's a pressing need to call for a complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. This is what Security Council Resolution 2774, which Russia voted in favor, calls for. It demands an end to the conflict as soon as possible. Let's respect it. I thank you.
Representative of France for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Pakistan for convening this meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Yencha and Assistant Secretary General Musuyev for their briefings. Mr. President, since the beginning of this war 3.5 years ago, the collective voice of the international community has repeatedly condemned Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and has been calling on Russia to fully respect international law, the UN Charter, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. These calls were strengthened with renewed conviction since the launching of the US-led peace initiative. Sadly, as we have just heard from our briefers, the war is not ending. On the contrary, for yet another month, Russian forces have been attacking the cities of Ukraine, causing death and destruction. June has been the single deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since at least May 2022, with the number of missiles and loitering munitions launched by Russia into Ukraine increasing tenfold from June 2024. Once more, the vulnerable, children, women, and the elderly are disproportionately affected, with 100 casualties among children alone. This trend has continued in July. These attacks have inter alia targeted energy infrastructure and disrupted power supply to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant for the first time since December 2023, further endangering nuclear safety. We note with extreme concern that according to the WHO, nearly 40% of all attacks against healthcare facilities worldwide this year took place in Ukraine, causing casualties among medical personnel and patients. We are likewise concerned about reports on the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. Greece joins the Secretary General in strong condemnation of the latest severe attacks by Russia against civilian population and infrastructure in Ukraine, and we also condemn any attacks against civilians which constitute blatant violations of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, this year's annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict verified a 105% increase in grave violations against the children of Ukraine, identifying for the third consecutive year the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups as responsible for these violations. These findings are compounded by this year's recently released Council of Europe's report on the human rights situation in the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia, which demonstrates that Russia's war of aggression has continued to lead to immense human suffering. Mr. President, ensuring accountability is both a prerequisite for peace and a deterrent for further war. On that front, Greece welcomes the July 9th ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, in which the court held Russia unanimously accountable for flagrant and widespread abuses of at least 10 fundamental human rights in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and at least 2022. Greece also welcomes the signing of the agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine for the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, we have long advocated for peace, which is long overdue. We welcome the 3 rounds of direct bilateral talks and the agreements on exchange of prisoners, including the most recent one on July 23rd. However, we regret that peace efforts have not produced any other tangible results and have eventually stalled. We reiterate that no peace effort can have any substantial results if hostilities continue. Therefore, it is imperative that any peace efforts should be approached in good faith, starting by agreeing to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, in line with international law and the UN Charter, and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. Now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I also would like to thank ASG Yencha and ASG Msuya for their informative briefings and welcome the participation of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, as the war in Ukraine stretches beyond 1,250 days, the human, moral, economic, and geopolitical costs of this aggression continues to mount. Contrary to the hopes of many who yearns to escape from this dark tunnel, Russia is intensifying its relentless attacks, now deploying hundreds of deadly drones and missiles daily. Indeed, June marked the highest monthly civilian casualty toll in 3 years, with 232 killed and 1,343 wounded. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate, and civilian suffering is deepening. We reiterate that such large-scale and indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute a clear violations of international humanitarian law. The Republic of Korea once again strongly calls for a full, immediate, and unconditional cessation of hostilities to prevent further civilian casualties. In this regard, we support the recent call by the United States to achieve a long overdue ceasefire within 50 days. And we urge Russia to respond to this call, one that has been echoed by nearly every other member of the international community. Now more than ever, as the casualties continue to mount and the war shows no signs of abating, the urgency for a ceasefire is undeniable. We have already witnessed the concrete benefits of such a ceasefire during another major ongoing conflict. Although the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains dire today, earlier this year, during the fleeting ceasefire in Gaza, humanitarian conditions on the ground markedly improved. Hundreds of aid trucks were able to enter Gaza, delivering much-needed food, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies to suffering Palestinians. This clearly demonstrates that an immediate halt to hostilities is not merely symbolic. It is a vital step toward alleviating civilian suffering and creating the necessary space for diplomacy. On another front, we also take note of the third round of talks recently held between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul to seek an end to the conflict and bring about sustainable peace. We do not expect a miraculous breakthrough from just a few meetings. However, we do hope for the restoration of normalcy for the innocent civilians who have endured more than 3 years of immense hardship. They need a respite from the terrible nightly drone swarms, now numbering in the hundreds each day. We believe the realistic path to ending this war and achieving lasting peace begins with a prompt ceasefire agreement, followed by a sustained negotiations supported by confidence-building measures such as prisoner exchanges and return of fallen soldiers. These efforts must not be used to buy time for destructive or territorial ambitions, but instead must reflect the genuine political will to end this war. Mr. President, a major obstacle to achieving these goals lies in the ongoing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK. Despite repeated condemnations from the international community, this illicit collaboration has been prolonging the war in Ukraine by enabling the large-scale transfer of ammunition, artillery, and missiles from the DPRK to Russia, as well as the deployment of North Korean troops in a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and relevant Security Council resolutions. Moreover, such cooperation poses grave risks to the security of the Republic of Korea and to regional stability. Potential military assistance and technological transfer from Russia to DPRK represent a serious and growing threat to the safety of the Korean people and to broader peace in Northeast Asia. We reiterate that all forms of cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang must fully comply with relevant Security Council resolution and international law. In closing, Mr. President, the international community can no longer afford to stand idly by while this senseless war continues. This is why we must come together, raising a united voice to demand an immediate ceasefire and pursue a just and lasting peace. We sincerely hope that those who initiate this war will heed the principled call of the international community. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thanking the representative of Republic of Korea for the statement, I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank ASG Yanka and ASG Monsieur for your informative briefings today. Colleagues, the world has rallied around President Trump's call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed, and we echo that call again today. Yet week after week, night after night, we see the number of Russian assaults grow. June was the deadliest month yet, and July is on track to be even deadlier. This makes a mockery of the diplomacy that Russia claims to support. And the consequences are even more devastating for the people of Ukraine. Across 5 nights, from the 18th to the 23rd of July, Russia launched over 940 drones and 59 missiles at Ukrainian cities, killing 20 civilians and injuring a further 216. Just days before, a record-breaking 728 long-range drones were launched on Ukraine in a single day. Since the start of the invasion, over 13,500 civilians have been killed and more than 34,000 injured. This includes more than 200 children killed or injured since March alone. We cannot allow ourselves to become desensitized to these figures. Behind each Russian strike, there is a person, a family, a community whose lives have been torn apart by Russia's brutal military invasion. The Shigids are one such family. On the 5th of June, as a Ukrainian firefighter arrived at the scene of a Russian attack on Chernihiv, he discovered that his wife, his daughter, and his grandson had all been killed. His grandson was only a year old. 3 generations lost to cold-blooded Russian brutality in just one night. This is not an isolated incident. Families like the Shigids are being torn apart across Ukraine and have been since February 2022. Russia has a clear and unqualified obligation to uphold the UN Charter. Russia also has an obligation to respect the Geneva Conventions and to the protection of civilians under international humanitarian law. There is simply no justification for brutal aggression like this. The reality is clear. Ukraine, a country illegally invaded by Russia, continues to show its commitment to peace. But President Putin prefers war. He is shunning diplomatic efforts made in good faith to bring an end to this horror, a horror of his own making. There is no ambiguity about what needs to come next. It is time for Russia to stop prevaricating and agree to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as the first step towards a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretaries General Yencha and Masuya for the updates provided and for their work. In the 33 days that have elapsed since our last meeting on this topic, the situation on the ground has gotten considerably worse. The continuation of intense fighting in several regions and escalated attacks on civilian infrastructure continue to devastate civilian lives and drive displacement in Ukraine. Meanwhile, nuclear safety and security remain under threat, with the IAEA reporting yesterday that their team at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to hear shelling, explosions, and gunfire almost every day. Earlier this month, the site's training center was targeted in a drone strike, resulting in damage to its roof. Guyana deplores the ongoing attacks on or near nuclear power stations, given the risk of severe and indiscriminate harm that could result. We call on the parties to the conflict to eliminate such plans from their military strategies. Mr. President, we have been consistent in reaffirming full respect for the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Likewise, we have also been consistent in calling for a peaceful end to this war. We welcome the talks that have taken place in Istanbul and join fellow council members in welcoming the recent agreement for another round of exchanges of prisoners of war. Nevertheless, we have noted that these periods of progress continue to be interrupted by increased attacks and heightened rhetoric. We urge the parties to ensure that progress is sustained by prioritizing the protection of civilians, fulfilling their international legal obligations, and ultimately agreeing to end this war peacefully and definitively. Guyana believes that many opportunities have been missed since the adoption of Resolution 2774 5 months ago, a resolution which, while not perfect, provided the first glimmer of hope since this conflict erupted. 5 months on, it appears as if the main obstacles standing in the way of peace are the absence of firm political will and an unwillingness to compromise and find common ground. Meanwhile, the civilian death toll continues to mount, and many more lives are devastated and put on pause. We call on the parties to engage in good faith and to bring an end to the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children. This includes those displaced from their homes and mourning the loss of loved ones in both Ukraine and Russia. Guyana further reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and to comply with its obligation under international humanitarian law to facilitate unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in the temporarily occupied territories. Mr. President, colleagues, it may be tempting, I'm sure, to imagine that one party will emerge victorious from this conflict. However, with nearly 50,000 civilian casualties reported to date and an unprecedented humanitarian crisis emerging, there will be no winners in this war. While the buildings are damaged can be rebuilt, the lives lost cannot be resuscitated, nor the injuries erased. But one thing remains clear: a call for peace is always relevant, and the choice of peace is never too late. The time to answer that call and to choose peace is now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Yensha and Assistant Secretary General Joyce Masuya for your briefings. And I welcome the representative of Ukraine. More than 100 days have now passed since this Council adopted a resolution imploring a swift end to the war and urging a lasting peace between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Since then, there have been some positive developments. UN Security Council Resolution 2774 paved the way for technical talks in Saudi Arabia and bilateral talks in Istanbul, resulting in the return of thousands of prisoners of war. But the progress we've seen has fallen far short of what is needed. Ignoring this Council's call for lasting peace in Resolution 2774, Russia has continued to kill Ukrainian civilians. Russian drones and missiles have struck schools, playgrounds, apartment buildings, and nursing homes. Russia has deployed thousands of DPRK troops to its front lines and sent tens of thousands of Russian soldiers to die on the battlefield just to gain a small amount of ground. Mr. President, colleagues, the war, killing, and destruction must end. As President Trump has repeatedly stated, there is no military solution to this conflict. On July 14th, the President of the United States put Russian President Putin on notice to agree to a peace deal within 50 days. If Russia does not agree within that timeframe to stop the attacks, the United States is prepared to take further measures. Additionally, we again urge all countries, including China, to stop exports to Russia of dual-use goods that contribute to Russia's war industrial base and enable its drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. Beijing's claim to have implemented strong export controls on dual-use goods falls apart in the face of daily recovery of Chinese-produced components in the drones, weapons, and vehicles that Russia uses against Ukraine. Mr. President, now is the time for all UN member states to do our part to bring this war to an end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, I wish to express my appreciation to ASG Yanka and Masuya for their briefing. My delegation remains gravely concerned by the continued deterioration of the humanitarian and security situation in Ukraine. The latest developments only reinforce the urgency and the complexity of the crisis before us. In that regard, I would like to make the following points. First, we are deeply troubled by the ongoing escalation of attacks impacting civilians and essential civilian infrastructure. the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure are obligations enshrined under international law. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold these principles without exception. Second, we remain convinced that there can be no military solution to this conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy are the sole means to bring an end to this long-standing conflict and achieve sustainable peace. Continued hostilities serve only to prolong suffering and further diminish prospect for a sustainable peace. Diplomatic channels must remain open. In that context, we welcome the ongoing discussions in Istanbul between the Russian Federation and Ukraine concerning the exchange of prisoners of war. While these negotiations are not without challenges, they represent a constructive step on the humanitarian track. Progress, even incremental, on such issues can pave the way for broader engagement and contribute to building the trust necessary for peace. Third, we emphasize the important role of the international community in supporting diplomatic initiatives and fostering conditions conducive to a peaceful settlement. Any durable resolution will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and genuine commitment to dialogue. We reiterate our call upon all parties to exercise restraint, recommit to diplomatic efforts, and work towards an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. In closing, Mr. President, our delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all efforts aimed at addressing the underlying causes of the conflict and achieving a just and lasting peace in accordance with the United Nations Charter. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this crisis deserve a future founded upon peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Panama regrets the accident that occurred yesterday in the Russian Federation, and we'd like to extend our condolences to the relatives of those who lost their lives, as well as the people and government of Russia. President, we welcome the convening of this briefing and the timely participation of Mr. Yencha, ASG, and Ms. Msuya, ASG. They have provided us with detailed information about the humanitarian situation and security situation in Ukraine. Panama continues to be deeply concerned by the prolonged war in Ukraine. It is alarming that this conflict, with its devastating humanitarian consequences, has become a regular item on our agenda. We should not allow violence to lose its ability to move us, nor for the normalization of suffering to be imposed upon our collective responsibility. Like in any conflict, those who are most affected, those who bear the brunt, are those who have the least responsibility, that is to say, civilians who only wish to live in peace. This reality should compel us to ask ourselves, have we really learned from the tragedies that characterize the 20th century? Attacks on schools, hospitals, critical infrastructure, an increasingly vulnerable population, physically and emotionally exhausted. All of this cannot and must not be normalized. The detailed reports that Mr. Yencha and Ms. Msuya have provided us today clearly show with eloquent figures the lamentable effects of the attacks and the collective and individual tolls of the attacks on civilians. as well as human displacement and the deterioration of the humanitarian situation. And this is in addition to the increasing cost of the reconstruction of Ukraine. All of these are sad consequences of the conflict, which, rather than winding down, continues without any prospect of a solution. We do not think enough about the victims of the fighting, and the reports have shown that approximately 950,000 Russian soldiers have died or have been injured, and some 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died since the conflict erupted. Every day that passes without our acting deepens the collective trauma and erodes the minimal bases of the social contract. We cannot allow fear and despair to prevail over security and dignity. We urgently need to redouble diplomatic and humanitarian efforts to protect those who are not able to protect themselves, in line with our obligations pursuant to the Geneva Conventions. President, we are gathered here today in this chamber, which was as a result of the 1955 spirit, precisely to avoid situations such as those in the past recurring. However, the figures that we've heard this morning and that we continue to hear every month defy this founding commitment. We are particularly concerned about nuclear security. At the beginning of this month, an attack completely disconnected the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. On the 13th of July, the IAEA team reported shots from light weapons being fired close to the power station, and in addition to this, incidents with drones in the surroundings. As DG Grossi has clearly said, the situation around the power plant is increasingly delicate and sensitive, and any incident could have catastrophic consequences. Panama echoes the words of S.G. Guterres, which he stated on the 5th of June, in which he condemned the wide-scale attacks with missiles and drones. The continued attacks continue to be one of the main characteristics of the conflict, and this represents a major threat to regional and global stability. Fair and lasting peace in Ukraine necessarily involves fully respecting Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, pursuant to the principles laid out in the UN Charter. We urge the parties to immediately cease hostilities and to fulfill their obligations pursuant to international law, including international humanitarian law. In February of this year, one of this Council's resolutions offered a window of opportunity to a negotiated solution. Unfortunately, this opportunity was not taken advantage of. In this regard, we encourage the parties to continue direct talks, such as the talks that were held this week in Istanbul, which led to a new agreement for the exchange of prisoners of war. In addition to this, we reiterate that only through dialogue, diplomacy, and respect for these principles will it be possible to curb this spiral of suffering and to restore a peaceful and sustainable solution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this important meeting at the request of Slovenia, Denmark, France, Greece, the Republic of Korea, and the United Kingdom. I also thank Assistant Secretary Generals Miroslav Jenča and Ms. Joyce Musia for their comprehensive and sobering briefings. We welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, the end of the Ukraine conflict remains a complex but not insurmountable objective. Encouragingly, 3 rounds of talks in Istanbul between the parties have facilitated the exchange of thousands of prisoners of war and detainees, as well as progress in the return of over 300 Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation. While a ceasefire agreement remains elusive, such confidence-building measures, alongside the reported intention to establish joint working groups to regularly address political, humanitarian, and military dimensions, offer signs of continued engagement through diplomatic channels. In this regard, we wish to make 3 key points. First, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned by the indiscriminate use of long-range missiles and drones in densely populated areas, resulting in widespread civilian suffering and destruction of civilian infrastructure. According to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, missile and drone attacks in June 2025 were tenfold higher during the same period last year, causing extensive damage to energy, water, medical, and other vital civilian infrastructure. Since the beginning of this year, approximately 6,754 civilians have reportedly lost their lives, including an alarming increase in casualties among children. Reports from UNICEF further indicate that about 70% of the children in Ukraine, roughly 3.5 million, are facing severe material deprivation, including lack of access to food, clothing, heating, and education. For more than 3 years, the lives of these children have been shaped by fear, loss, and trauma, a situation that must not be normalized. In this regard, we underscore the urgent need to sustain and strengthen humanitarian assistance to reach the estimated 12.7 million people currently in need across Ukraine. We reiterate that the protection of civilians must be central to all military operations, with strict adherence to the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, and call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international law. Second, we urge the parties to the conflict to demonstrate the necessary political will and commit to structured negotiations aimed at achieving a sustainable resolution of the conflict. Building on the progress made in Istanbul, we join others in encouraging high-level political dialogue to address substantive matters for a ceasefire and a lasting peace. We welcome reports of private engagements between the heads of the respective delegations and urge continued negotiations in good faith with a focus on political and humanitarian priorities. We commend the sustained efforts of the United States, European leaders, and other partners in support of a comprehensive ceasefire. In light of the deep human suffering caused by the conflict, we appeal to the parties to prioritize the well-being of their citizens and seize the opportunity to bring an end to hostilities. Third and finally, the international community must begin to prepare for the post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization of Ukraine. The scale of devastation is immense. An estimated 139,000 square kilometers of territory are reportedly contaminated with landmines and explosive remnants of war, posing enduring threats to safety and livelihood. Short-term financial requirements for budgetary support, reconstruction, and humanitarian assistance have been estimated at approximately 40 billion annually by the Kyiv School of Economics. According to the World Bank's Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment done in February this year, long-term reconstruction costs may amount to over 524 billion in the coming decade. Thus, the challenge ahead is significant. We welcome international coordination mechanisms supporting Ukraine's recovery, including the Multi-Donor Coordination Platform and the Ukraine Recovery Conference. The guiding principles are outlined in the Lugalo Declaration: partnership, reform focus, transparency, democratic participation, inclusivity, and sustainability remain fundamental. We also note with appreciation the increased engagement of the private sector in the recent recovery conference held in Rome, underscoring the crucial link between sustainable development and durable peace. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reaffirm that only a comprehensive ceasefire and peace agreement will enable the government and people of Ukraine, including over 10 million displaced persons, to begin the arduous process of recovery, healing, and rebuilding. Sierra Leone reiterates its support for all efforts that seek to protect civilians, uphold international humanitarian law, and advance a just and lasting peace that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, while addressing the legitimate security concerns of all parties to the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas, Mr. Miroslav Vienka, and Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Joyce Msuya, for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, unfortunately, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine continues, as does the killing of innocent civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. In addition to the continued recorded heavy losses in property and infrastructure, including vital facilities, which Algeria has condemned several times for being a flagrant violation of the rules of international law, including international humanitarian law. And despite the positive momentum we have witnessed recently, which was embodied in long-awaited direct meetings between the two parties, the logic of confrontation and fighting still dominates on the ground, and unfortunately, the logic of polarization still affects the state of affairs, undermining diplomatic efforts to end this war. This conflict has not only affected the peoples of the region, but has also had spillover effects in many regions of the world, especially developing countries, as a result of the repercussions of this conflict on food and energy markets across the world. Faced with this situation, my delegation would like today to stress the following points. 1. Algeria reiterates its call on the two parties to show restraint and wisdom and to make the lives and safety of civilians their priority and to fully abide by the rules of international law, including international humanitarian law, which expressly prohibit the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. 2. Algeria stresses its firm conviction that the solution will not come by the force of arms or by imposing hegemony, but by favoring the language of constructive and inclusive dialogue and negotiations, and the ability of both parties to overcome differences and to find a peaceful solution that will put a definitive end to hostilities and end the war. In this regard, Algeria calls on the parties to focus effort on the ongoing negotiating process and to be inspired by the positive results achieved so far through the exchange of prisoners to reach a just and lasting peaceful solution based on the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and is responsive to the legitimate security concerns of the parties. 3. Algeria renews its call on the international community to redouble its diplomatic efforts to create an atmosphere conducive to negotiations that brings views closer together, away from polarization and narrow geopolitical calculations. Finally, Algeria renews its firm commitment to support any international efforts aimed at finding a peaceful political solution that satisfies both parties and putting an end to this war and returning the entire region back to safety. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank ASG Yencha and ASG Masuya for their briefings. We've noted that Russia and Ukraine have in recent times continued to implement the consensus reached in previous negotiations and promoted the exchange of prisoners of war and the remains of fallen soldiers. They also held the third round of direct talks a few days ago, in which a new consensus on the continuation of the exchange of prisoners of war and other humanitarian issues was reached. China welcomes these positive developments and calls on the parties concerned to maintain the momentum of the peace talks, continue to build consensus and enhance mutual trust with a view to reaching a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement. We've also noted that in recent days, Russia and Ukraine have continued to carry out large-scale drone and missile strikes against each other, resulting in heavy casualties and infrastructure damage and destruction. China is deeply concerned and saddened by this, and once again urges the parties to the conflict to show maximum restraint, comply effectively with international humanitarian law, and refrain from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure under any circumstance. It is imperative that the two sides make joint efforts to de-escalate on the battlefield at an early date. We have further noted that Russia and Ukraine have recently issued statements toward each other about how to restore peace in Europe and achieve a political solution to the crisis. The major parties in the international community have also repeatedly released positive signals on dialogue, negotiation, and ceasefire, and continue to engage in diplomatic efforts for peace talks. China welcomes all efforts towards peace and encourages both Russia and Ukraine to continue to show political will and flexibility, while the international community continue to call for peace, build a consensus over peace, and carry out efforts for peace. All parties should jointly make practical efforts to promote a political solution to the crisis. President, China has always maintained an objective and impartial stance on the Ukraine issue and has been committed to promoting peace talks and political solution. We have been actively carrying out diplomatic mediation in accordance with 4 shoulds proposed by President Xi Jinping while maintaining effective communication with both Russia and Ukraine. We have initiated the establishment of Friends of Peace Group on the Ukrainian crisis with Brazil and other countries in the Global South in order to build greater synergy for a ceasefire and the realization of peace. China will, as always, play a constructive role in the political settlement of the crisis. President, I'd like to respond to the statement by the U.S. representative. As we've pointed out many times in the Council, China did not start the Ukraine crisis, nor is it a party to it. China has never provided lethal weapons to any party to the conflict and has always strictly controlled dual-use materials, including the export of drones. We urge the U.S. to stop shifting blames on the Ukraine issue or creating confrontation, and instead playing a more constructive role in promoting ceasefire and peace talks. What's more, President, I'd like to take this opportunity to say a few more words. This past Tuesday, when the Council held an open debate on the peaceful settlement of disputes, the U.S. representative took advantage of the meeting to attack and accuse China on the South China Sea issue this past Thursday. When the Council held an open meeting on cooperation between the UN and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the representative of the U.S. once again started its provocation by slandering and smearing China on Xinjiang-related issues. Today, when we are considering the issue of Ukraine, the representative of the U.S. again started to spread false information and lies about China. Within a single week, the U.S. has made groundless accusations at China in the Security Council multiple times. They only prove that what the U.S. cares about is not maintaining international peace and security or promoting the political settlement of war or conflicts, but rather using this council to suppress and attack other countries and engage in political manipulation to serve its own agenda. As a permanent member of the council, the U.S. should be ashamed and disgraced by its own words and deeds. We urge the U.S. to change course at an early date and engage constructively in the work of the Council. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. To be frank, when we heard about this meeting on Ukraine being requested by our Western colleagues, there was a fleeting thought in our minds. We thought that the reason for this was the fact that at the start of July, we received a poignant letter from a group of Ukrainian political prisoners addressed to the Security Council President. Let me remind you that it was signed by well-known politicians, human rights defenders, civil servants, and MPs who are today prisoners of the Zelensky regime. For instance, Elena Berezhnaya, Vyacheslav Boguslayev, Vitaly Godina, Artem Dmitruk, Alexander Dubinsky, Oleg Kulinich, Miroslav Oleshko, Alexander Oleynikov, Yuri Rabucha. You all had an opportunity to read that letter and to see for yourself that the number of political prisoners in Ukraine runs into the thousands. Constitutional norms and laws are not being implemented. People are being put behind bars for, and here I quote, calling for peace and the holding of elections, for opposing the war between Slav peoples, for their political and religious convictions, for criticizing the forced mobilization, and for their active civil stance, end of quote. Ukrainian political prisoners are calling on the Security Council to achieve a repeal, and here I quote again, of all illegal sanctions imposed since the start of the war on Ukrainian citizens. For instance, unconstitutional and repressive means of political persecution, end of quote. So it's not just a letter, it's a cri de coeur. Now, back then, we didn't draw the Council's attention to this document to avoid giving our foes a pretext to try and portray all of this as Russian propaganda, as they always do in such cases. Think no further than the fact that in January 2024, Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen, was tormented to death in a security service of Ukraine cell, whose HR revelations were written off as Russian propaganda by the Kiev regime. Starting in 2014, any criticism of the Ukrainian government, according to what they say is Russian propaganda. This unsophisticated logic persists to this day. The forced mobilization, which the human rights defenders mentioned in their letter, is also, according to the Kiev posse, a concoction of the Kremlin. Yet all Ukrainians know that Zelensky's draft officers, the Territorial Centers for Recruitment, or TCRs, well, they're literally abducting people in broad daylight on the streets, in malls, pharmacies, and sports clubs. In doing so, they're using the harshest, at times inhumane methods. Hundreds, if not thousands, of cases have been reported of draftees being killed or maimed. All Ukrainians are talking about this, but the authorities deny it. There's a plethora of videos on social media where men are being nabbed in the streets. They're being ripped from their families, badly beaten, pushed into buses, frequently leaving their small children alone in the street. And Ukrainian civil servants are calling this, cynically calling this, scenes staged by the Moscow film studio. If we believe the Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainians are queuing up to go to the front. Can you imagine what it's like for ordinary Ukrainians to listen to such vile lies? However, recently, this system of collective lying and covering up for each other faltered. Staff at one such draft center in Transcarpathia, during one of their raids, seriously injured a 45-year-old man, József Szybentiev, an ethnic Hungarian who's a citizen of both Ukraine and Hungary. As a result, he ended up in hospital and died after a few weeks. And this despite the fact that Mr. Szybentiev was drafted but then deemed unfit for duty for health reasons. There are hundreds of such cases in Ukraine. They are the norm for the so-called Zelensky concentration camp. That's what Ukrainians are calling their own country. Yet, for our Western colleagues, this topic is taboo. This legal free-for-all is something all European and US human rights defenders aren't talking about. They've been ordered to never speak ill of Ukraine. And this poor soul, Mr. Szybentiev, no one would have found out about his fate. But, unfortunately for Zelensky and his sponsors, he turned out to be a Hungarian. Thus, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Hungary protested decisively against the killing of their citizen and demanded official explanations. In response, the Ukrainians said that supposedly the draftee had attempted to flee and then died in hospital of natural causes. Of course, the Ukrainian side, just like in many other cases, despite the obvious facts, refused to bear any responsibility for the man's demise. These lies, of course, did not satisfy Budapest, and the scandal rages on. President, it's a good thing we have Hungary, which takes a principled stance. Hungary does not want to, in contrast to the overwhelming majority of other EU countries, does not want to turn a blind eye to the dictatorship in Ukraine, but who will defend the other unfortunate souls who have been forcibly mobilized. Those who the regime, steeped in lies, led by the Kiev princeling, those who are being thrown into the meat grinder to further Western geopolitical interests. For instance, there's an elderly woman from the city of Myrev in Kharkiv region. Recently, she tried to stop the draft office from taking away her son. She clung on for her life to the minibus full of conscripts, preventing it from leaving. But draft officers pushed her harshly, and as a result, she was unconscious, lying in the middle of the road. Images of this abuse caused outrage across Ukraine. Try to guess what Zelensky's accomplices said in response. You're right, this was all characterized as Russian propaganda. Ukrainians are now used to the fact that getting justice and punishment for all those violating all legal norms, including the Constitution, is impossible. In those rare cases where criminal cases are initiated against draft office staff because they're abusing authority, the State Bureau of Investigations, which conducts pretrial investigations, in that case, that investigations office does not find any crimes. They say no crime has been committed. What are ordinary people left to do, those who don't want to go and fight? Increasingly, we're seeing them blocking roads, blocking settlements, and not letting draft officers, who they deem cannibals, to enter their towns and cities. Ukrainians absolutely hate staff of these draft officers who are known as politsai in common parlance, the term used for fascist punishers during the occupation of Ukraine. Hate and despair of Ukrainians has reached such a point that they're publishing and sending to the Russians the military coordinates of draft officers and celebrating when we strike them. This is what the former comedian, a self-styled dictator of all Ukraine, has achieved. President, when preparing for today's meeting, we were expecting that Western cheerleaders of Ukraine will at last say that the persecution of canonical Orthodox Christians in Ukraine has reached such a high point. This, given the fact that on the 2nd of July, the Ukrainian president issued a decree stripping the primate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Onufry, from stripping him of his Ukrainian citizenship on the basis that he supposedly has Russian citizenship, according to the Security Service of Ukraine, using pseudo-evidence. He denies this, but he's also being accused of, and here I quote, maintaining links with the Moscow Patriarchate and knowingly acting against the canonical independence of the Ukrainian Church from the Moscow Patriarchate, representatives of which are openly supporting the Russian aggression against Ukraine, end of quote. And this is happening in a country where the freedom of religion and the separation of church and state are enshrined in the Constitution. The medieval Inquisition could have learnt a lot from the Zelensky regime when it comes to persecuting dissent and witch hunts. As for our Western colleagues, they're averting their eyes in shame when we point out that these are the kinds of authorities they've given rise to in Ukraine. And today they said absolutely nothing, not a word about this outrageous situation I just mentioned. Something else our Western colleagues are silent on is another part of this witch hunt, which the Kiev princeling is engaged in of late. Having found out that anti-corruption structures independent from the president have prepared compromising material and criminal cases against Zelensky and his inner circle, he used his pocket parliament to ensure that this body now reports to the Prosecutor General's office, who answers to him, the president. Thus, as we speak, his accomplices are destroying documents exposing corruption in the highest echelons of power, including the Kiev usurper and his team, who've spent billions of dollars in budget funds and Western aid. Now, having gotten their hands on this evidence, the evidence that exposes them, they're now backtracking, supposedly in response to a negative uproar in Ukrainian society and abroad. It's worth noting that the bodies that are being struck, the bodies that are being hit, were initially set up under Western pressure, portrayed as an antidote to corruption. But we didn't hear anything about that today. I cannot but mention the ravaging of the Hill of Glory memorial complex in Lvov. This can only be construed as desecration of the memory of countless victims of fascism who gave their lives fighting against Nazism. Timeless heroic deeds were done by them, by Soviet citizens. To further their short-term interests, the Ukrainian authorities have obscenely exhumed the remains of 355 Soviet warriors, including heroes of the Soviet Union, who fought for the liberation of Lvov from German fascists. Not one of the civilized Western representatives nor the UN Secretariat mustered up the courage to condemn these shameful atrocities committed by Ukrainian neo-atrocities. And this despite the fact that every year in the General Assembly we adopt a resolution on combating the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to the fueling of contemporary racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, emphasizing that it's unacceptable to destroy memorials and monuments commemorating the heroism of those who fought against Nazism in World War II, and the illegal exhumation and transfer of their remains. So why did we convene today's meeting if not to discuss these topics I just mentioned? Well, it was convened to artificially maintain the Ukrainian file afloat at the Security Council, especially against the backdrop of the ongoing slaughter and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, on which our Western colleagues are much less eloquent. The meeting is also an opportunity to criticize Russia for methodically and consistently destroying military infrastructure and sites related to Ukraine's military capabilities, blowing up warehouses containing Western-supplied ammunition and equipment, striking areas where Ukrainian soldiers, foreign instructors, and mercenaries are gathering. In a word, Russia is doing everything it should, given that a war is being waged against it imposed by NATO countries. Does this ritualistic, propaganda-laden paradigm deserve a Security Council being convened? Don't waste your time. Don't waste ours. We destroyed, are destroying, and will continue to destroy the military infrastructure of the Kiev regime as part of our demilitarization of Ukraine, which is one of the objectives of our special military operation. We do not strike civilian objects. These objects are being affected solely due to the activities of the Ukrainian anti-missile defenses stationed in the residential areas of cities in violation of international humanitarian law norms. Ordinary Ukrainians know this full well. They're afraid not of Russian strikes, but of the actions of their own soldiers. They also know that we're not fighting them, we're fighting against the Kiev regime, which has sacrificed its country, together with all Ukrainians, in the name of the West's anti-Russia project. The more you deliver military supplies to Kiev, the more we will strike. It's not our choice. We've been consistently proposing the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis through diplomacy for a long time now. But you won't agree to that. For now, you're ready to continue fighting Russia using Ukraine's hands, and the fact that there are fewer Ukrainians around does not concern you. That's why you're stubbornly trying not to notice the fact that the regime in Kiev, which is completely corrupt, it's trying to save the skins of Zelensky and his posse, putting the future of Ukraine in question. We will discuss this in detail at a separate meeting we've requested for the 31st of July. At that meeting, we suggest focusing on actions which undermine the search for a diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian conflict, including attempts to thwart direct Russo-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for this statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Pakistan. I thank ASG Miroslav Yencha and ASG Msuya for their briefings. Pakistan remains deeply concerned by the continuing hostilities and devastating consequences of this conflict, particularly its humanitarian dimensions. Into its fourth year now, this conflict has exacted a harrowing human cost, with millions displaced, lives and livelihoods shattered, and widespread civilian infrastructure damaged. Its protracted nature has vividly laid out that war spares no one, and its effects threaten peace and stability far beyond the region. It is unfortunate that despite the diplomatic efforts at the start of the year, including Security Council Resolution 2774 and multiple limited ceasefire understandings, tangible progress has remained elusive. While prisoner exchanges and talks in Istanbul offer glimmer of hope, the ongoing violence, death, and destruction from relentless attacks has continued to cast a shadow over the nascent and fledgling peace efforts. It is imperative that the echoes for peace must be heard. Peace in Ukraine is long overdue. The calls for ending this conflict should not be allowed to be muted by the continued drums of war. In this context, Pakistan reiterates the following urgent imperatives. First, the protection of civilians is a must. The international humanitarian law is clear, and it is vital that it must be upheld unconditionally. Targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure under any pretext cannot be justified. Second, military solution and continued escalation is akin to pursuing a dead end. Continued attacks and the recent surge in these attacks has only deepened the suffering of people affected by this conflict. Sustainable peace demands de-escalation, ceasefire, and unwavering commitment to dialogue. Third, peaceful settlement must be our Lord Star. That is our commitment expressed in Resolution 2788 adopted earlier this week. Diplomacy is the only path forward. We welcome the talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. These, however, must translate into tangible de-escalation, and steps such as prisoner swaps should catalyze broader political negotiations aimed at ending this conflict. Pakistan has been a consistent advocate for peace. From the very outset, we have called for de-escalation and giving primacy to dialogue and diplomacy. Only a sincere and meaningful dialogue which addresses security concerns of all sides is anchored in the principles of UN Charter and international law and respects the relevant multilateral agreements can help lead to peace that is just and enduring. Pakistan stands ready to support all regional and international efforts that pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give you the floor, Madam.
Thank you. Mr. President, I would like to reply to the assertion that the United States made, and I quote, groundless accusations, and that somehow this was a misuse of the Council. I reject these allegations. The United States has raised pertinent information, and in a case in point today, we noted that materials and components supplied by China are ending up in Russian weapons, weapons which Russia is using to strike Ukraine, killing Ukrainian civilians, and destroying Ukrainian infrastructure. If China is sincere in calling for peace, it should stop fueling Russia's aggression. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and the representative of China has asked for the floor now to make a further statement. I give you the floor, sir.
Thank you, President. I'll be very brief. China on the issue of Ukraine our position has been repeated so many times. We are calling for a ceasefire, and we're committed to promoting peace talks. China's efforts have been seen by all. For the U.S., I would like to say that there are so many hotspot conflicts and complex international situations. The international community needs cooperation and solidarity instead of diversion and confrontation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for those further remarks. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to express Ukraine's sincere appreciation to the Presidency of Pakistan for convening today's meeting. We are also grateful to ASG Miroslav Yencha and ASG Joyce Msuya for their insightful briefings. Tragically, since the last meeting of the Security Council in June, the security situation in Ukraine has not improved. On the contrary, the Russian Federation has intensified its campaign of terror through relentless drone and missile strikes, deliberately targeting civilians across our country. This month, each massive attack by the Russian Federation on Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure has broken previous records in the number of missiles, drones, and bombs used, resulting in further civilian casualties and destruction. Ukraine strives to ensure that the world hears the story of every life lost as a result of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression. Each life is irreplaceable, a profound loss that can never be undone. Allow me to share one of, unfortunately, many such stories. This month, in the village of Pravdane in Kherson region, a Russian drone strike claimed the life of Dmytro, a boy just 1 year and 1 month old, as he stayed in his great-grandmother's home. The Russian military's use of FPV drones to kill people, children, has become increasingly widespread, a tactic that epitomizes the cruelty of this war of aggression. Russia's continued assault on civilians underscores the urgent need for sustained and increased international support to protect Ukraine's population. We are profoundly grateful to all partners providing air defense systems and other essential security assistance. We urge the continued and expanded supply of these vital capabilities, because for millions of Ukrainians, these systems are the difference between life and death. Enhanced military support to Ukraine is vital and is not designed to prolong the war, as the Russian side falsely claims, and will do so next week at this chamber. On the contrary, this assistance helps to stop Russia's war of aggression. If the aggressor state does not feel the consequences on its own territory, it will never stop its colonial war. Mr. President, while the Security Council meets every month and discusses the Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia gradually continues its efforts to legitimize the temporary occupation of Ukrainian territories through the systematic militarization, indoctrination, and assimilation of Ukrainian children and youth. Under the guise of educational and so-called patriotic programs, Russia enforces a policy of Russification, implements its nationalist agenda, integrates local youth into its military structures, and cultivates loyalty to the Kremlin's regime, all while attempting to erase Ukrainian identity. A key component of this policy is the involvement of children and adolescents in paramilitary organizations. Through state-run movements such as Young Army, and the movement of the First, the Russian Federation is building a mobilization reserve to sustain its war of aggression not only against Ukraine, but also against what it labels the collective West and other perceived adversaries. These actions constitute clear violations of Russia's obligations as the occupying power under international humanitarian law, as well as international human rights law, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Russia is exploiting education and leisure, spaces meant for development and growth, to indoctrinate and militarize children whose worldviews are still forming. They are being turned into tools of war propaganda within a system disturbingly reminiscent of North Korea. We call on the international community to confront these egregious violations and to hold the Russian Federation accountable for its systematic attempts to normalize war of aggression, temporary occupation of the territory of Ukraine, and the instrumentalization of children in its war efforts. Mr. President, the Russian Federation continues to pursue criminal policies aimed at forcibly altering the demographic composition of Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories. Under the pretense of mortgage and housing assistance, Russia is actively resettling its own citizens into these areas, a strategy designed to entrench its temporary occupation of the territory of Ukraine and undermine the rights of the local population. Through a preferential mortgage program, the Kremlin has created favorable conditions for Russian citizens, including military personnel, educators, families with young children, and workers in the cultural and social sectors, to purchase property in the temporarily occupied regions of Ukraine. This program is available exclusively to Russian citizens, effectively excluding Ukrainians and using housing as a coercive tool to pressure them into accepting so-called Russian passports. Furthermore, the Kremlin has drafted legislation setting out procedures for the administrative, that is, forced expulsion of so-called foreigners residing in the temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation territory of Ukraine who have not regularized their legal status under Russian law. In reality, this includes Ukrainian citizens who, through no fault of their own, remained in the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine but refused to accept Russian citizenship. These individuals are now labeled disloyal and deemed a threat to the Russian occupation administration and are therefore subject to expulsion from their own country. These actions represent a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. There must be no normalization of aggression through normalization of relations with the aggressor state, the Russian Federation, for as long as it continues to pursue imperialistic ambitions. And you have just witnessed how maniacal Russia is about Ukraine. Nor can there be normalization of Russia's perception as an influential power. Influence cannot be divorced from responsibility. As the renowned Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda wrote back in the 18th century, I quote, "It is commendable not to be liked by bad people," end of quote. In the case of the Russian Federation, we say it is commendable not to be liked by a rotten state. Mr. President, it has been 136 days since the United States have put forward a proposal for a full and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine has accepted it and has been consistently demonstrating readiness for diplomatic engagement. Ukraine has a clear political will. We remain open to any format that offers a path toward comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine. By contrast, the Russian regime continues to show blatant contempt for diplomacy. It consistently rejects credible peace proposals and ignores repeated calls for a full and unconditional ceasefire. Russia could end this war at any moment. Instead, it chooses escalation, launching strikes on peaceful cities and intensifying offensive operations in pursuit of military advantage. Russia also uses peace efforts to spread in manipulative narratives. Following a recent negotiation round held in Istanbul on July 23, its representatives made misleading public claims regarding the initial list of abducted children submitted earlier by Ukraine. We must clarify these facts. This initial list of 339 names was submitted by Ukraine as a confidence-building measure. To date, Russia has provided fragmented responses, offering partial information on fewer than 1/5 of the children. There has been no response at all concerning over 200 children, including those from the Kherson orphanage. Russia mentioned children from the list allegedly returned. In fact, only 6 children were returned, 5 of whom are siblings. This was the result of a year-long humanitarian effort mediated by the state of Qatar, a process demonstrating the power of third-party engagement and not Russian goodwill. The Kremlin continues to expand its war of aggression against Ukraine, drawing others into its campaign of terror, including the use of North Korean troops and Iranian-manufactured weapons. We therefore call on the United States and the international community to intensify coordinated pressure on the regime in Moscow and its military-industrial complex, as well as on those around the world who support and enable Russia's war of aggression effort. The time for action is now, and there is no room for delay. Mr. President, the Russian Federation has been extensively and systematically using anti-personnel landmines as a method of warfare against Ukraine's security and defense forces. When Ukraine signed and ratified the Ottawa Convention, it did so in good faith, relying on security assurances provided by the parties to the Budapest Memorandum. It could not have foreseen that a signatory to that very memorandum, the Russian Federation, would later on launch a legal, unprovoked, and unjustified full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. As a result of Russia's widespread use of landmines, Ukraine has found itself in an unequal and unjust situation that severely constrains its inherent right to self-defense as guaranteed by Article 51 of the UN Charter. Accordingly, and in line with Article 62 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Ukraine has taken difficult but necessary decision to suspend the operation of the 1997 Ottawa Convention. Mr. President, as none of the sovereign and independent member states of the United Nations would, nor will Ukraine accept the temporary occupation by the Russian Federation of any part of its sovereign territory. Ukraine seeks a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, one rooted in the principles of the United Charter and backed by credible, binding, and long-term security guarantees. A full, immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire for at least 30 days remains a critical first step. It is the foundation for halting the war of aggression, restoring confidence, and enabling meaningful negotiations. At the last meeting in Istanbul, Ukraine clearly advocated for such a ceasefire. We also emphasized the importance of a high-level summit between leaders to lay the groundwork for a durable and comprehensive peace. Ukraine stands ready to convene such summit meeting till the end of August. The Security Council has a critical role to play at this juncture by expressing its unequivocal position on the urgent need to terminate hostilities as the first step towards comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine on the basis of the UN Charter. In this context, we reiterate our call to the Council to adopt without delay a resolution demanding an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine strongly encourages all members of the Council to support and engage in moving forward this crucial initiative, thereby demonstrating a credible commitment to ending the war of aggression started by the Russian Federation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank you for convening this meeting and the briefers for their important interventions. As Russia is persistently and brutally continuing to wage its unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, let me draw your attention to 4 critical points. First, recently we have witnessed a significant intensification of Russia's military campaign. Growing pressure along the front line is being reported, accompanied by the intense air raids across the country. The latest renewed long-range aviation activity by Russia close near to the Polish-Ukrainian border has prompted Poland to scramble our fighter jets several times to secure our airspace. I would like to draw this Council attention to this escalation. More than 24,000 drones has been launched against Ukraine's cities since the start of this year. In the first half of 2025, Russia killed and injured almost 7,000 Ukrainian civilians, over 50% more compared to the same period last year. By the beginning of July, Russia has reportedly enlisted over 700,000 servicemen to the war, a new grim record. Second, we commend the recent announcement by the US President Donald Trump, who continues his efforts to bring Russia to the negotiation table and engage in good faith negotiations. While Ukraine maintains its willingness to reach a just agreement, Russia's response remains blatantly predictable as they continue to mock all endeavors designed to bring genuine peace. Russian officials repeated Moscow's maximalist demands that they have underpinned Russia's neo-colonial war from the day one, and which are built on the feverish dream to rule Ukraine and erase its independent identity. In Istanbul, once again, we learned that Kremlin is not interested in peace. The peace is so endlessly talked about while continuing to kill, maim, and steal somebody else's land. Third, Supporting Ukraine state fighting with aggressor and providing assistance based on development and humanitarian needs remain Poland's priority. This was reflected also during the Polish presidency in the EU. From the very first day of the full-fledged war in Ukraine, Poland has been a gateway of aid not only for Ukrainian refugees, but also for European logistics, energy and medical hubs. While the ongoing Russian aggression that brings immense suffering of civilian population and destruction of the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, Poland has significantly increased its financial engagement. In 2024, we allocated more than $40 million for voluntary contributions transferred to international organizations to support Ukraine, including the UN system. Our development cooperation focuses on supporting reconstruction, civil protection, and crisis preparedness in Ukraine. Fourth, Russian war of aggression remains the main threat not only to the security of Europe and our region, but also to the whole international system based on the principles of the UN Charter and international humanitarian law, as well as to the UN system itself. Each day, Russia continues to openly violate the UN Charter, showing disrespect to jointly agreed rules and, above all, to human life. Moscow is strong-willed to reshape the world's order based on international law. This will not happen. The support for Ukrainians is our response to these Russian attempts. Poland strongly believes that a sovereign and independent Ukraine is an indispensable element of a stable world security architecture, as every peace-loving nation has the right to exist and participate in global cooperation. Therefore, we will continue to stand by Ukraine to defend its independence and secure a just and lasting peace based on international law. We are fully convinced that Ukraine is fighting not only for its own freedom, but also for the security of all free nations. Mr. President, in conclusion, we firmly appeal once again. It is time for Russia to end this illegal, brutal, and unsustainable war. We welcome Ukraine's interest in genuine negotiations and call Russia to engage in peace talks and to stop conducting the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Furthermore, we urgently, persistently call for the return of the kidnapped Ukrainian children. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this meeting, and thanks to our distinguished briefers for sharing their assessment of the disastrous consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The past weeks have seen the continuation of two trends. On the one hand, Ukraine has shown a genuine commitment to peace by continuing to call for an immediate unconditional ceasefire as a first step to ending this war. On the other hand, Russia has continued its indiscriminate missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns. Intentionally directing an attack against civilians or civilian objects or causing disproportionate civilian harm is a war crime. Earlier this month, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine published its report on the protection of civilians. It concluded that June 2025 saw the highest number of monthly civilian casualties in the past 3 years, with 232 people killed and 1,343 injured. This is unacceptable. I underline once again the EU's steadfast determination to put an end to Russia's war of aggression and to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, in line with the decisions of the UN General Assembly. We, as Europeans, together with Ukraine, have been working tirelessly to this end, and we welcome all efforts in that direction. We have joined Ukraine and international partners, including the United States, in calling for a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire. These pause in hostilities could serve as a vital step toward reducing civilian suffering and allow for further exchanges of prisoners of war and for the return of forcibly displaced Ukrainian children. Russia could end its war now. It could accept a full and unconditional ceasefire, as Ukraine has. We call on the Council to exert maximum pressure for a ceasefire. This would provide space for meaningful talks aimed at ending Russia's war of aggression and achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace grounded in the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We urge Russia to cease its aggression and withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine immediately, completely, and unconditionally. I remind this Council that Ukraine has an inherent right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine is the party defending itself. There can be no sitting on the fence on this. Furthermore, the EU strongly condemns support by third countries and actors and entities therein which enable Russia to sustain its war of aggression. The EU condemns the continued military support provided by Iran, Belarus, and the DPRK. We urge all countries to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia in its war of aggression. The European Union, Mr. President, underlines the importance of humanitarian relief effort and confidence-building measures, notably the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilians, and the return of all Ukrainian civilians, particularly children, that have been forcibly transferred or deported to Russia and Belarus. We commend the efforts of OCHA and its humanitarian partners in providing assistance to those in need. Full, safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access must be facilitated for humanitarian relief to reach all civilians in need, including in areas under temporary Russian occupation. In closing, Mr. President, I reaffirm the EU's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And I also cannot but note, Mr. President, that the Russian Federation, as it continues, including today, to shed crocodile tears for the oppressed of the world and for the UN Charter, is continuing to pursue with increased relentlessness its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine and against Ukrainian civilians. And while it is injecting hundreds of billions of dollars to its military to pursue its illegal war in Ukraine, it doesn't have a penny to offer to alleviate hunger, to alleviate poverty, to promote sustainable development for tens of countries around the world and their citizens who desperately need them. The hypocrisy, the double standards are eye-popping. We implore this Council to use all the powers in its disposal to be able to impose an unconditional and full ceasefire and to be able to promote a just, a lasting, a comprehensive peace in line with the UN Charter. We implore you. The European Union, on its part, will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of three Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. And we thank the Presidency of the Council for convening this meeting, and we commend ASG Yencha and ASG Msuya for their comprehensive briefings and continued efforts. The UN plays a vital role in Ukraine, delivering life-saving humanitarian aid to those in need and ensuring that the facts of the war are documented with accuracy and impartiality, upholding the principles of human dignity and international accountability. Today, I would like to highlight three key messages. First, Russia's war causes immense civilian suffering and constitutes a flagrant breach of international law. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that has been going on for almost 3.5 years and continues to inflict widespread humanitarian devastation. Over the past weeks, Russia has further intensified its drone and missile attacks, systematically targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, power grids, and schools. Many innocent lives have been lost. And these are not isolated cases. They represent a calculated campaign of terror and destruction. International humanitarian law is being ignored. The Security Council must not look away. And the international community must go beyond statements. We must act decisively to safeguard civilians and bring perpetrators to justice. Baltic states commend Ukraine's humanitarian coordination and resilience under this barrage of fire. We also welcome the results of the Fourth Ukraine Recovery Conference that took place in Rome on 10 and 11 July 2025.
It showed mobilized further international support and investment for Ukraine's reconstruction, reform, and modernization. Second, the path to peace must begin with Russia ceasing its war. We note the Ukraine-Russia meeting held on Wednesday in Istanbul upon the initiative of President Zelensky. Russia's usual pattern of response, yet again another record-scale indiscriminate attacks on Ukrainian cities, reveals its true intentions: escalation, not peace. No one wants an end to this war and civilian suffering more than the Ukrainians. Hence, we call on for the international support to a full, unconditional ceasefire, to which Ukraine has already committed, as the first step towards real negotiations. And so far, Russia has been utterly insincere in its offers of a ceasefire, showing that it fears peace more than war. It is up to Russia now to demonstrate genuine readiness to engage to end the war. Finally, a just peace in Ukraine must be based on the UN Charter and international law. Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is a frontal assault on the principles of the UN Charter. Russia's attempt to invoke root causes buys into the false historical narrative and tries to justify Russia's imperial ambitions and idea of multipolar instead of multilateral world. And the Baltic states reaffirm our full support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And we will never recognize Ukraine's occupation, neither de jure nor de facto. Mr. President, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is not a regional issue. Its consequences extend far beyond. And we have a collective responsibility to uphold the UN Charter and ensure respect for international law. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.